Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here this evening at India Week. While I may not be from India, I like to think of myself as a friendly neighbor in the region, Spider-Man style. Your girl next door, your best friend just across the water, all the way from Sri Lanka. And as a Sri Lankan, I'm especially pleased to be here as India has long been one of Sri Lanka's closest friends and most reliable partners, always ready to step in times of need. And now, without much further ado, let me commence the much-awaited conversation this evening with Sir Vince Cable. Let's dive right in.
Thank you.
In Eclipsing the West, you argue that we are moving towards a fundamentally different global order. Do you believe the West fully understands the scale of that transition yet?
My point is, well, first of all, just thank you for the honor of inviting me, and I'm very sorry I'm keeping you all from your dinner, but it's lovely to be able to talk to you. The point about my book, it's a very simple one, that if you go back 30 years, what we call the West or the North, Europe, America, Japan, accounted for about 60% of the world economy, and it's now 40%. And the emerging powers, as they're sometimes called, was then 40%, now 60%. And that's mainly China, but increasingly it's India. And India is now growing far faster than any other significant economy in the world. And if you look forward, which is what my book, Eclipsing the West, is about, you look forward to the mid-century, there will only be three major economic powers in the world, which will be the United States, China, and India, unless the European Union gets its act together, which currently doesn't look likely.
Your book compares two superpowers with very different political and economic systems. What surprised you most while examining India and China side by side?
Well, everybody in the past has tended to put China on a pedestal because of its phenomenal economic growth. And it is a miracle, actually, what they've achieved over 40 odd years since Deng Xiaoping's reforms. But China is now running into headwinds. The economy is slowing down. They've got a demographic problem. The one-child policy means that there's a whole generation of young people missing, and this is going to hit them economically. While at the same time, as China slows down, India is now growing very fast. And I speak from a vantage point of having been coming backwards and forwards to India for 60 years. And I've seen the transformation since the mid-60s, phenomenal infrastructure improvement. I go back to the day when you had to queue for a weekend to get a telephone call. When you cross from one state to another, you had to pay octroi taxes on your goods. India has become the infrastructure is not at Chinese levels yet, but phenomenally improved rails, airport, roads, telecommunications. That's point one. Secondly, India has a single market, a unified economy, didn't used to have. Freedom of movement of people, capital, goods, and you now have phenomenal connectivity, with the digitization of the economy. And these things are going to continue to drive economic growth in India. There are weaknesses, we all know them, massive amount of underemployment, a lot of the permit Raj is still there, but the strengths now outweigh the weaknesses. And if you're looking at a comparison between India and China in the middle of the century, it's not at all clear that China will be the dominant of the two. I'm, in my spare time, a professor at Shenzhen University in China. And one of the challenges I sometimes put to the Chinese students is try to imagine that India actually overtakes you. And for them, it's a very shocking idea. I mean, they can't understand how this country that they regard as rather chaotic and doesn't have the discipline of China could possibly do so well. But the simple truth is that the economic fundamentals are now pointing very strongly in India's direction.
You describe India and China not simply as superpowers, but as superstates. Why is that distinction important, and how does it change the way we think about global influence in the 21st century?
Well, I wanted to find a word that summarized how China and India were fundamentally different from all the other countries in the world. We're talking vast population, 1.4 billion, India now slightly bigger, but on a totally different scale from anywhere else. And very, very disparate, different languages, different religions, to the extent that's allowed in China, totally different ethnicities, and the political challenge of trying to hold together these vast, disparate countries while at the same time achieving growth and the reduction of poverty. It represents something quite different from anywhere else in the world. And so I invented this term superstate to describe these two countries.
You've also said that India and China often behave like frenemies, suspicious of and dependent on one another. How dangerous is the current lack of trust between the two countries?
Well, there is a serious lack of trust, and whenever I go to, the Chinese are perhaps less conscious of this, but whenever I go to Delhi and I talk to people, particularly in the foreign affairs and defense establishment, it's very clear they see China as number one enemy. They don't say that publicly, but I think that's implied. And when you go back over the history of the border clashes, going back to the war, 1962, that's clearly part of the Indian official thinking, which is partly why India has become much closer to the United States, the Quad grouping, and so on. My view is that what the current Indian government is doing, which is more subtle, trying to have a multipolar, multi-alignment, I think is the phrase that the foreign minister uses, is much the right approach. Particularly given the very erratic way in which Trump is running the United States, it would be very dangerous, I think, to become over-dependent on the US for security guarantees, which probably wouldn't be honored. And India has the same challenge that we now have in Europe of trying to balance relationship with China and the United States and not becoming over-dependent on one or the other.
As India and China compete for influence across Asia, smaller nations increasingly find themselves navigating competing pressures. What does this shifting balance of power mean for countries like, say, Sri Lanka, for example, trying to maintain strategic and economic independence?
Well, I think for countries like Sri Lanka is one of the relatively few countries in the subcontinent where India has really excellent relations. I spoke to a conference in Sri Lanka a couple of weeks ago, and there was real appreciation that when they had their terrible cyclone last November, India was the first country to come rushing in with help. They see the relationship as essentially benign. And one of the things that they're very anxious to do, because Sri Lanka is in a terrible economic position, it's very debt dependent, partly because of Chinese loans. It's been hit very badly by the oil shock. they desperately need to develop good long-term trading relationships. And part of the vision that they now have is developing a common trading area with the south of India, the more dynamic states of the south, like Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Telangana, and so on. And this potentially, there is a South Indian, Sri Lankan trading area, 200 million people. And what I think the Sri Lankans want to do and should do is press India for a much more generous trading arrangement and effectively to integrate the economies much more closely, because they are friends. There is no real issue of dispute. And I would hope that India is able to respond to what I think is a real need, but an opportunity on Sri Lanka's part.
But from your perspective, can smaller nations realistically balance both powers, or are they eventually forced into one sphere of influence? You think smaller nations can balance India and China realistically?
Well, it is going to be very difficult, because it's very clear that the old international order is breaking down. And the small and medium-sized countries of the world depended on an international rule of law that frankly no longer exists. And power is gravitating towards those countries that are pretty self-sufficient and have a good deal of economic and military political clout. India is one of those countries. China, US also, potentially the European Union, but that's only potential. It's very difficult in many areas to see how the small countries of the world are going to fit in unless they're better organized. But there is a big opportunity, I think, for countries like India to develop alignments with not just with its neighbors, but with the ASEAN group. I've never understood, for example, why India hasn't joined the RCEP, the Southeast Asian grouping, and potentially with other groupings which bring together some of the smaller countries of the region.
One of the major themes in your book is the redistribution of economic power away from the traditional West. Does this lead to geopolitical confrontation, or can the transition remain relatively stable?
Democratization. Yes, I mean, we draw a sharp distinction between the autocracy of China and more democratic regimes, of which India is clearly one. I take myself a more nuanced view about China. I'm not a China-phile. I'm very critical of a lot of the things they do, but actually China is a much more flexible and in many ways more open country than we often give them credit for. I spend a lot of time trying to engage with what you might call the educated middle class in China. I have a big social media account, Xiaohongshu, and the people I talk to in China, they have personally a very free life. Right? They have VPNs to get around the censorship, they travel freely, and providing they don't cross red lines, which is publicly attacking the party and the President Xi, they can get away with quite a great deal. And certainly if you're an entrepreneur, and if you're working in the high-tech industries in China, you can enjoy really quite a higher level of personal freedom. So I think that the simple caricatures don't necessarily apply. I also think that over time, the Chinese system will become, well, not necessarily democratic in the Western sense. When I talk to Chinese leaders privately, they say that what we'd really like to be is a kind of giant Singapore, where there is an element of choice, but where one party keeps getting reelected. And you have that basic strength that the Chinese have of consistency, long-term outlook, planning, the ability to think ahead, which many democratic countries, unfortunately, like Britain, don't have.
China's rise was driven heavily by manufacturing and state-led industrial policy, while India's growth has leaned more towards services, technology, and domestic consumption. Looking ahead, which model do you think proves more resilient?
Well, unfortunately, India made one terrible mistake in economic policy, and we're going back to the 60s and 70s. They completely missed out on the pattern of development that you got in Japan, then Korea, then China, which was exporting manufacturers to the world. India just missed out completely. And one of the reasons why China is so far ahead is because they took that road and India didn't. There are some compensating factors. India now has a very good services sector, internationally competitive. It has a growing appeal to investors trying to get out of Chinese supply chain in advanced manufacturing, and that will gradually take hold. There's a couple of things I picked up from the statistics recently. There's a big report produced in Australia of the 55 leading technologies and which countries dominate them. And in about 40 of the 55 core technologies, China was ahead, and the US were the remainder. But the third country in almost every category was India. So there is a lot of innovation and technological improvement going on in India, which will eventually break through. And a key to that, of course, is people. India and China now have by far the largest number of STEM graduates and PhDs internationally. I'm talking science, technology, mathematics. And not all of the Indian STEM graduates are at the level of Massachusetts Institute of Technology or Tsinghua University, but large numbers of them are. So India does have this resource, human resource, together with a growing amount of innovation. And over time, if it does build up its competitive manufacturing, is in a position to catch up on where the Chinese have got to.
You've spent decades studying globalization and trade. Are we now entering a less globalized world or simply a different one centered more around Asia?
Well, some funny things are happening on what people call globalization. Because of all the protectionist trade barriers being put up, Trump's tariffs, you're getting a slowdown in the growth of trade in goods, manufacturers. But trade in services is not being impeded. Trade in data flows is not being impeded. You can't stop ideas flowing across frontiers. So that what we call globalization is changing its shape. A lot of the old patterns of production through the Chinese supply chains, they are now being switched. The Chinese companies are very smart, and they're relocating to Southeast Asia, to some extent India, Latin America, but the goods are still flowing. And despite all the complaints about China's trade surplus, it's growing and growing. And globalization hasn't stopped.
And after writing the book, are you ultimately optimistic or pessimistic about the century ahead?
Well, I'm fairly conceited in trying to look to the middle of the century. I think looking a century ahead is way beyond. I don't expect to be around at the end of the century, or probably even the middle of the century. But what I've tried to write about in this book is about the future. And a key theme is that the future is very much about India. And I think we in the UK would do best, I think, to have a certain humility and recognize that India is now a great country, and we should show proper respect.
But if we were to revisit this conversation in 2040, what do you think will have mattered more in shaping the world order? Economics, technology, or geopolitics?
Well, geopolitics is something that's preoccupying us at the moment. It's really China and the United States and potentially India. Somebody mentioned early on that Russia doesn't. It's not a serious economy. Somebody once described the Soviet Union as upper Volta with rockets, and Putin's Russia is not much better than that. So we're really talking about two superpowers and potentially another one, which is India. That's the future, and my perspective is economic. But technology is woven into that. It's very clear at the moment that China is overtaking the United States technologically. There are some key areas like big AI language models that they haven't quite caught up. The very, very low nanometer chips, they haven't quite got the manufacturing technology right, but it's coming. But in almost every other respect of technological change, particularly green technology and energy, increasingly things like quantum physics, the Chinese are very much up there technologically. And that's why when I look at India and what's happening in India, the key things I look at are things like, patents, number of innovative companies, the number of technologists coming through the education system, because these are the things that in the next 10 or 20 years will really matter.
We have time for just one more question. The current Middle East crisis, how do you see it reshaping the balance between the two Asian powers?
The current crisis?
Yeah.
Yes, well, it's very clear that Trump made a terrible mistake. And to put it very starkly, the Iranians have won. They've won by surviving, and they've won by discovering that they have leverage that they didn't have before because of the Straits of Hormuz. I mean, it is worrying in many ways, but that is the reality. And Trump would be very wise to retreat, I think, before any more damage is done. In terms of the effects of this war, we in the UK and India and other countries which import energy are going to hit a wall of discomfort in a few months' time when the stocks have run down. So we should prepare for that. I should just make one final point about the current crisis. Before I became a politician, I was in Shell, the international oil company, and indeed worked with people in India to set up Shell India in the mid-90s. But the key point is that within 2 years, maybe even within a year, you're going to get a vast outpouring of additional oil supply from countries that are no longer subject to quotas, Qatar, Emirates, Brazil, the rest of them, Venezuela now. And at the same time, demand will be depressed because people are switching heavily into renewables. So you're going to get a big switch back from very high oil prices probably to oversupply. So that's something to look forward to.
Would you like to take one or two questions from the audience?
Well, if people have the appetite.
Can we... Do we have an extra mic? Oh, wait, I don't mind. Let me walk.
So Vince Cable, very nice to meet you again this evening. We've talked about India and China and America, but it'll be very interesting to hear your perspective on what's happening to this country, our country.
Well, I used to be a British politician, as you know. I was a party leader, but I'm sort of retired from British politics, and I've decided not to be a backseat driver. But just a few quick observations. I think it would be very detrimental to the UK if the Prime Minister were to go. There's a lot of people who are very critical of Starmer for good reasons. He's made mistakes. But when a country changes its Prime Minister in the same way that we change football managers, it ceases to be a serious country. And if I were advising the Labour Party, I would tell them to pipe down, to keep quiet, and just keep on trying to provide rather better government and get away from all the silly instability and Westminster point scoring that we're seeing at the moment. It does our country no credit.
Thank you.